Welcome to History 112, Lecture 11, Reforming Government. Right around the turn of the century, this new idea entered American politics, and that's progressivism, and it was based on an optimistic view that society could continually improve. And they believed that the natural laws of the market weren't enough. No laissez-faire economics, no social Darwinism. They believed that humans, through their own effort, could make progress and make things better. But by the end of World War I, this idea starts to kind of subside as people feel that a lot has changed. So we're looking really at almost a 20-year time period where people are really invested in making rapid change and real reforms to American society. Now, one of the key groups of people in the progressive movement are what are called muckrakers. They were named by Teddy Roosevelt, who meant it as an insult. A muckraker is someone who kind of goes out to the river when the tide is low and when the river level's gone down and goes to that really stinky mud right there searching for any kind of scrap that they can recycle. And that's what Teddy Roosevelt means when he applies as a journalist, is that these are people who are just trudging through the nastiest, foulest material looking for some little tidbit that they can sell for a few cents. But these muckrakers, these journalists, they're going to expose scandals, corruption, and injustice at this point in time, and they're going to go after trusts and railroads. Now, the muckraker movement had begun as early as the 1860s, but it really picks up pace at the turn of the century. And these are individuals, these journalists, that believe the only alternative to corrupt government was active interest and action by the populace as a whole, and they believed that journalism and newspapers had a vital role to play in educating people so that they could take that interest and have that action. Now, the main impulses during this about 20-year period is they're anti-monopoly. They're against trust. They like to bust them up. They believe that the good of the individual is linked to the good of society as a whole and vice versa, and they're concerned with what they call the victims of industrialization. They also believe in knowledge. They believe that social and natural sciences can improve society, but they believe also that modern life is too complexly left in the hands of old institutions. This means that they are going to look towards building something new for what they see as the good of society. But that's going to also lead to some real injustices when they start to believe in certain theories, especially theories regarding race. Out of that optimistic view that society could really be improved through knowledge and through effort and through all of these other things, this idea about reforming government really takes off, and it really begins with a middle class movement centered on the East Coast. Now, during the 1880s and 1890s, people like the mugwumps had argued for cleaner government. So there was some backlash from the populace we talked about in previous lectures. But throughout the 1880s and 90s, out of some of those arguments we heard about earlier, a number of states adopted secret ballots. Before this, what would happen was party bosses would hand out pre-printed ballots with only their candidates on them. This meant party members only had to turn them in, but it also made it impossible to do what's called splitting your vote. That's voting for different parties for different offices. For example, you might want to vote for a Republican mayor, but you might like a Democratic candidate better for governor. When party bosses were handing out their own ballots, that was an impossibility. So now secret ballots come in, and now the government has printed the ballots with all the candidates on them, and you would fill it out in secret in a polling place. And that was a big and important change and an early step towards cleaning up government. Now, we should understand that early on, progressives tend to target local government rather than national government because it's easier to get things done. We also have to understand the city government in the 19th century was extremely corrupt because of the political machines, who were not only mobilizing large voter turnouts, but also many immigrants depend on them for services and jobs. And a lot of businesses had established very lucrative relationships with city governments and were especially threatened by reform, particularly when it comes to any industry that might fall under the general heading of vice. Now, respectable citizens in the 19th century would not get involved in local government because it was considered vulgar until you see a new generation of activists and the muckrakers. So as we're leading into the progressive era, people start to get concerned with what's going on, and there begins to become an impulse for change. Now, that really kicks into gear with the Galveston disaster in 1900 because the worst hurricane in American history strikes Texas. The inept and corrupt city government was completely crippled by the disaster, and reformers were outraged over the government failure to get things done and use that outrage to get a new city charter. And they're going to replace the city government with a nonpartisan election, and they're going to essentially try to eliminate the political machine from local politics. And about 400 other cities are going to try to follow that model over the next 20 years. While Galveston became the model for a number of reform attempts, there were some other approaches that happened as well. For example, a city manager Now, this would require the elected officials to hire an outside, nonpartisan expert to run the government. So they were simply there to confirm the decisions of a supposedly neutral individual. They also went to what are called odd year elections in some places, which would be a simple system whereby the cities would separate their elections from presidential congressional races to limit the impact of high party turnout from political machines. Because in a presidential election, those political machines were getting everybody out. But by having it in a different year, they were thinking that this would reduce that impact. They would also create what were called at-large districts in some cities, which meant that district and ward bosses would be less influential because instead of representing a particular neighborhood, you now represent the city as a whole. Now, a different approach was creating a strong mayor. Some cities believed that if the mayor was strong enough at the expense of a city council, this would be more effective. Their assumption was that it would be easier to convince a single mayor of a need for particular reform than it would be to convince enough votes out of a corrupt city council. And Tom Johnson becomes a very good example of what that type of mayor looks like. Now, he was the four-term mayor of Cleveland from 1901 to 1909. He had been a congressman and made a fortune in steel, and progressives in the city of Cleveland just happened to have enough strength at that time to get a progressive elected as mayor. And once he becomes mayor, Johnson declares war, as he puts it, on the party bosses. And he is going to go after powerful business, especially the streetcars in the city. And he's going to force them to adopt reasonable rates, and he's going to try to force public ownership of public utilities. He's also going to do other things like expand parks and try to improve sanitation. He's also going to force the meatpacking industry to accept city inspection of food. And by the end of his term, Cleveland is regarded as the best governed city, according to many progressives, and it becomes the example of what progressives could do if given a chance. Some progressives are also going to turn to looking at state government because their local efforts are not always successful, and the popular perception of state legislatures was that they were incompetent, corrupt, under the complete control of party bosses. And generally speaking, in most American states, at least two of those three were true. So when progressives focus on state governments, their first task is going to be to break the control of the bosses, and they're going to use things like initiatives and referendums as a possibility to allow people to directly vote on legislation and certain issues and thus bypass the corrupt legislature in the first place. And that had been an old populist demand, and 20 states adopt this during the progressive era, and one thing we're going to see is some of those populist ideas from a couple of lectures ago. They take off just because it was a culturally marginal group didn't mean that they didn't tap into something really important in the American psyche, and the idea of initiative and referendum in many states is one of them. The other one was direct primaries and recalls. The primary was an attempt to take the candidate selection away from the bosses, and by 1915, every state had that for at least some offices. And we're familiar with the primary because it's how we do things today. For example, we have two rounds of voting for the presidency. You have a round where there's many people campaigning, and we're going to narrow it down to just one Democrat and just one Republican candidate. That was a new thing back then. And recall is really also very important, and that's going to allow citizens who are dissatisfied to remove a candidate from office. And although that is something that's slow to adopt in most states, California being the notable exception to that. Now, there were a lot of efforts in a number of states to clean up politics itself. 22 states banned gifts or campaign contributions from corporations, 12 restricted lobbying. A variety of states go after particularly important lobbying groups directly. California is going to go after the Southern Pacific Railroad. New York is going to go after public utilities. And New Jersey, where most trusts were incorporated, is going to go after those trusts directly. Now, the impact of all that is a lot of political machines are broken by this. Many reforms are going to improve life for the average citizen, but at the same time, voter turnout is going to decline sharply. It was 81% average throughout the 19th century. It's going to be down to 59% by 1912. What this means is people don't vote as much because those political machines are providing them with a direct incentive to vote. Now, people are wondering what they get out of it. You'll sometimes hear people today say, what difference does my vote make? Well, back in the days with the political machine, everybody knew. So by breaking those machines, it also detaches a lot of voters from feeling connected to politics. So it has its good and its bad. Now, the machines are ultimately going to be replaced by smaller but powerful interest groups, and the first of these is going to be the farmers after the death of the Populist Party. Because again, the Populists were important. They did not last very long, but they really tapped into some important issues in American society. So what's the big idea here? Well, first and foremost, the progressives are going to want to clean up government and they're going to try to break the power of the bosses. And they're going to take a lot of approaches to that. And what they're going to get is better run cities and better run government. But in the long run, they're going to begin a process that ultimately lowers voter turnout and is going to have a lot of long-term consequences when it comes to American politics later on. See you in the next lecture.